Well, good morning.
Good morning.
So nearly 100 years ago, 54 anglers came together in Chicago because they saw what was happening to our nation's rivers, lakes, and wetlands, and they were determined to do something about it. A lot has changed in the last century, and the challenges we face today are different than the challenges we faced 100 years ago. But there's two things that have not changed. First, the Izaak Walton League of America is still committed to the protection of America's rivers, lakes, and wetlands, and to the ensuring that the opportunity to fish, to swim, and to canoe in those waters will be here for future generations. And second, agriculture continues to play a key role in the quality of our nation's waters, because so much of America is in farm and ranch land. Everybody lives downstream from somebody, and in America, just about everybody lives downstream from a farm or a ranch. Today we have three panelists who are going to talk about some of the challenges our agricultural system presents for our surface waters. Tomorrow we're going to hear from three more panelists who are going to talk about what we can do, each of us individually and all of us together, to address those challenges. So first today we have Dr. Jerry Hatfield, Director of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Laboratory for Agriculture and the Environment, right here in Iowa. Dr. Hatfield is one of our nation's leading experts in understanding the impacts agriculture has on our water, our soil, our air, and our future. Next, we'll hear from Dr. David Swardney from the University of Iowa, where he is Director of the Center for Health Effects of Environmental Contamination. There, he leads cutting-edge research that's helping us understand the health effects of environmental toxins, including the health effects of nitrates in our drinking water. And finally today, we will hear from Professor Neil Hamilton, Director of the Agricultural Law Center at Drake University School of Law here in Des Moines. Professor Hamilton has seen the impacts of agriculture on our waters firsthand, and he's worked to help us all understand the role that public policy and our legal system plays in the decisions that farmers and ranchers and others make that have such profound impacts on our rivers, lakes, wetlands, and our drinking water. We're really pleased to have three national experts right here in Iowa who are going to help us understand these issues. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Jerry Hatfield.
Thank you. And we will, slides are up. We're going to talk about the current state of our agricultural systems and what it means for all of the things in terms of soil, water, and air quality as we go through this process. So we're going to go through this. I'm just going to give you an idea of really what's changing. This is our cropping distribution across the United States relative to corn and soybeans right now. And if you look at that whole diagram, you notice that we have shifted the corn-soybean belt from Illinois and Iowa into North Dakota and South Dakota. In fact, there are counties as green as anything in the Midwest right now. So this shift has occurred, and we just finished this analysis a couple weeks ago, and here's what's changed in the eastern three cropping districts of North Dakota and South Dakota. Is you notice that those purple lines and those brown dots represent corn and beans, and basically, if you look at that, there's about 40% of each of those in those cropping districts, and that means there's 80% of that land area. And you see we've reduced hay, we've reduced wheat, we've reduced sugar beets and sunflowers and canola out of that. So a lot of people refer to this as the Iowification of the cropping systems that are out there, but it's going to come at a cost. It's coming at a cost because what we see is in any of the major rivers, the Sioux River, the Cheyenne River, and all of that in the eastern parts of those states actually have flashiness that they've never observed before, and we have higher sediment loads. And so just because we can grow something there doesn't necessarily mean we should grow it. But if you go back and look at what this means in terms of this, these are the 5 factors that have caused this change. We've done remarkable work in terms of genetics, shorter season, more resilient hybrids that allow us to move it north and east. The environment's changed, there's more precipitation in these areas. Management's changed, the post-harvest demand for it has changed, and then there's been a social aspect as well in terms of all of this. So we see these 5 factors that really have driven this change in cropping systems as we go across them. So you see this in terms of the dynamics that's going on, dramatic reduction in hay in there. And if you look at the Census of Agriculture from that was just released to now, as you notice that we've dropped pollinators, honeybees in those 2 states by about 60% as well. So we've had a remarkable impact, and I use the word remarkable with quotes around it in terms of this process. Here's another example, and this is from Iowa here. This is the carbon balance of corn-soybean systems. This is the traditional system that is across the Midwest. Typical, maybe a deep rip in the fall, field cultivation in the spring before we plant. That system loses 1,000 pounds of carbon per acre per year. That means if you farm 40 years, you've lost 20 tons of carbon out of that soil. So the system that we consider to be the optimum system across the Midwest is continually losing carbon. It means it becomes more resilient or more susceptible to all the things that are going on because we have this. And I'll just show you some diagrams as we go along. The other piece of this, and this is the Raccoon River, which is the water supply of Des Moines, is that what you see in terms of these nitrate levels that are continually going up in this are directly related to the fact that we took small grains of hay out of that rotation. So the nitrate levels aren't necessarily due to nitrogen fertilizer management, they're due to water management. And so you see these different practices that are going on in all of this. You have to sit and think, as we want to think about sustainability into the future, how do we need to look at our system from an entirely different perspective? How do we look at this from a way of being able to understand these dynamics in all of this? And so my objective is not to paint a real rosy picture and say, here's where we're at and all of this, but basically to give you the idea that we are in a crisis mode. We are in a crisis mode relative to our soils, our water quality, all these different things that are going on. And so what I look at it is the fact that the simplification of crop rotations is not necessarily a good thing. The simplification, we need to get diversity back on the landscape for all ecosystem services that we talk about. We need to have this continued decrease in soil organic matter is going to increase our reliance on inputs, and it increases our susceptibility to weather variation. We're going to be much more tied to any variation that's going on in the weather and all of this. We have water quality impacts, we have soil quality impacts in all of this. So our current state of agricultural systems can be considered to be somewhat negative in terms of all of these different things that are going on. You look at this, and I'm going to now give you the whole thing of how we got to start thinking about agriculture. Is really from this perspective, and that is the fact that it's a diagram that I put together with the sole intent of being able to create something that nobody can take apart and say, I just worked on this part of the puzzle. And so you really look at this, and across the center is that we take our raw inputs. We take carbon dioxide, we take light, we take water, we take nutrients, we put it through any sort of system, and I really don't care whether it's a grain, a tree, vineyards, and everything else. We put it in all sorts of different management practices that go with that, and we create quality and quantity in that product that's coming out. We wrap that around spatial and temporal because every one of those has a temporal dynamic. It's influenced by the weather. It has a spatial dynamic. It depends upon where it's placed on the landscape. And then that becomes the ecosystem. But that ecosystem really has 4 outputs. It has provisioning. That's what we produce in there. And that generally, that's how we think about agriculture. We think about how much we produce, And the other three are somewhat lost in there. Because the regulating piece of this, in terms of climate, water quality, soil quality, air quality, often second-tier discussions about agriculture. The other piece of this, in terms of supporting this, what do we have for pollinator habitat? What do we have for nutrient cycling? And all of this, and then finally the cultural aspect. And that's how we really look at our landscape from a view of either recreation, all the other pieces that go with it. So you look at all this different diagram, and all four of those are of equal size because there are of equal importance in how we need to start thinking about these dynamics. But here's what happens, is that if we think about those same ecosystem services, supporting at the bottom and regulating, provisioning, and culture across that, if we have it in a balanced diagram, any sort of disruption of that still remains in balance. But the current system, the way we have our systems, is that any imbalance causes that system to topple. It causes great disruptions in terms of productivity. It causes great disruptions in terms of erosion. It causes great disruptions in terms of water quality. And we've seen that as we've looked at over historically, that we really need to think about how do we go forward in all these different dynamics that are happening. Just to give you an idea, this is an example. This is the yield variation within the field, and all farmers are now realizing that we have a large amount of variation within fields. And so we just finished analysis, and it was over the weekend after I sent these slides to Scott, is that we've shown that when producers go and begin to make changes in that, we can actually reduce that variation. And I have one producer that we've worked with 18 years of yield monitor data has shown that over that 18 years, when he began to change practices, we improved his yield in that field, but we also made that field more uniform. That level of yield increase was 95 bushels per acre on corn, 35 bushels on soybeans. That makes it profitable in terms of these dynamics. Give you an example of this, and I spent a lot of time looking at climate impacts. I'm one of the USDA's top experts on climate change, and I can say that to your audience in that. So we do spend a lot of time in terms of climate change impacts, and I'll just look at this in a different perspective. This is Iowa corn production. This is the variation over time. This is the yield gap. This is how we failed to meet our potential yield and all of this. But I put it back in saying, economically, this is what we've lost. And you see, I'll just point out this year, 2012, that economic loss in not being able to achieve our yield potential in Iowa in 2012. And this is $3.50 corn. If it was really $7 corn, which it was in 2012, the economic loss to Iowa by not having the soil's ability to produce that crop, store water and produce nutrients, to sustain that crop, cost us $7 billion. We're talking about real economic loss. When we start thinking about what's the impact of soil, and what's the impact of having those nutrients move away from that soil. On a statewide basis, $7 billion is a large economic impact. And I was explained to this differently when I talk to legislators. Do you realize how much tax revenue you've lost? That you weren't able to extract out of people and all of this. And so you really look at this puzzle from an entirely different perspective. This is soybeans. We see that same loss that's in there. The bad part in all of this, if you look at those shapes of those diagrams, is that we haven't gotten any better at making our crops resilient to the climate that's going on. In fact, we'll make it worse as we continue to degrade our soils. So the cause of yield loss and all of this, there's high temperatures, there's low temperatures, all these different things that go on. Water is one of the major issues, is that the major factor that includes all this is water availability. And when we reduce our capacity of our soil to have organic matter in it, we reduce its capacity to store water and make that available to it. And so those areas within the field that become much more variable are a result of the fact that we've reduced the organic matter content. So what's the solution in all of this? Is that we have to increase our diversity in rotations. We've got to get away from the two-crop rotation system. We've got to reduce our tillage in all of this. We're going to have to begin to think about how we not till that soil out there. We've got to maintain that cover on the land, and we've got to value the soil. We've got to really start putting a value on the soil from that process. We spent a lot of time looking at modifications in this. This is a field that we have with cover crop and no-till. We've taken a whole field and converted it over to look at the dynamics of this. We're also looking at agroforestry. How do we put trees back on the landscape? Those happen to be pecans, and that area in between is actually grazed by animals, so we get the nuts off of it, and we also get the beef off of it in that standpoint. We've also spent a lot of time looking at what changes in all of this, and so all of those dots is where we've taken a soil sample within that. I want to show you that after 2 years of going to that cover crop no-till, is that we doubled the microbial biomass within the soil. We can have rapid changes going on. So one of the myths that's out there that we're trying to dispel is that it takes a long time to change soil. Actually, it takes 1 or 2 growing seasons. That field in which we looked at the changes over time is the first 7 years. There was changes happening, but after that 7th year, we've already begun to improve the capacity of that field to produce a crop. So we can change these changes very quickly. So I'll just leave you this diagram. You can imprint this on your minds now, is that from the ecosystem services perspective, when we talk about water quality, we talk about soil quality, we talk about production, all of this, we've got to start thinking of agriculture as an extremely holistic system in terms of how do we begin to look at this, how do we value it, and how do we begin to think about the changes that are necessary to meet some of the water quality, soil quality, and air quality goals that are out there. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hatfield. We're going to save the questions until we hear from all 3 panelists, so now help me welcome Dr. David Swarty.
Thanks. I'm going to make the argument, so the title of this panel is How We Use Our Land as Consequences, and I'm going to make sort of a full-throated argument on behalf of public health. I won't talk a lot about the conservation aspects of things, but I want to endorse what was just presented by Dr. Hatfield, that these conservation practices that he's arguing for, these changes to our cropping system, would minimize, and if not entirely reduce, studies have shown the health effects I want to talk about here, and the health challenges we have as a result of our agricultural system in Iowa and across the country. I want to... Okay, I can step in closer. There we go. I once had an advisor that talked about putting your conclusion up front. So if I want to leave you with one thing, from a public health perspective, what worries me is that our understanding of quote-unquote what is safe, it's evolving, and very rapidly, and oftentimes at a pace that far exceeds what we're able to do from a regulatory standpoint. Most of us think about regulations as being there to protect us. But oftentimes we're finding ourselves at odds where the science says the regulations aren't strict enough, and we argue over what should be done, and as a result, nothing gets done. And so I think the argument for public health is that we need to figure out how to make these two ends work together. And I want to present some of these cases here, really with an Iowa focus, because that's what I know best, but I do think there's some national sort of lessons to be learned. So if we want to talk about what I view as a public health challenge in Iowa, I think you have to talk about the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room in Iowa is actually 20 million plus hogs that we grow in confinement. And so this is a map of where we have our concentrated animal feeding operations. And so this is, for the hogs alone, that's 7 billion pounds of waste that's produced as manure that we try to utilize and apply to the land as fertilizer, but that's a complex mixture of a bunch of other things. And so I would argue that a lot of our public health challenges can be derived just from that mixture alone. So what does 7 billion pounds of manure a year look like? And so I'm going to turn to my colleague Chris Jones at IHR at Iowa, who has been writing a blog on some of these issues. And so he thought of this idea of fecal equivalence. You know, what unites us all? Everybody poops, right? There's a kindergarten book about this. So if you think about the amount of waste that is generated in Iowa, it's equivalent to a population of 134 million individuals. That's massive. So what Chris is showing here with this map is he's taking major watersheds in Iowa and showing you the population equivalents based off fecal waste. I mean, you're seeing the cities of Los Angeles in single watersheds here in Iowa. And that's the amount of waste that we're having to figure out ways to manage to protect ourselves and our resources from any of the contamination that could result. And contamination does result. I mean, what does that waste look like for our surface water quality? This is a map put out by the Iowa DNR showing our impaired water bodies under the 303D list. And so anything in red and yellow there is a water body that is not in compliance with the Clean Water Act. It does not meet its designated uses. So you're probably all familiar with the Clean Water Act. Fishable, swimmable. You say what you want to use a water body for, and then you have to ensure that the quality is sufficient to meet those needs. We aren't doing that. And I think that that map doesn't even really do it justice. If you look at the numbers, we have about 2,500 surface bodies in Iowa that we regulate under the Clean Water Act. How many meet all of their designated uses? 9. 9. That's 0.3%. Equally as shocking is there's about 1,100 where we admit that we don't have data to say whether or not we're compliant. So we just don't know how bad the problem really might be. And so I don't want to be an alarmist up here, but we have a massive data gap. And these things have implications for public health. So most of our attention when it comes to nutrients is thinking about the dead zone. You've probably all heard about the dead zone in the Gulf. And Chris and researchers at the University of Iowa have shown that Iowa does its fair share. A disproportionate load of nutrients are going to the Gulf from the work here in Iowa. That leads to low oxygen regions in the Gulf of Mexico where ecosystem can't be supported. You have loss of biodiversity. You know, this is what we think about. It made the New York Times, right? Iowa nice being put to test because of our soil challenges. But I'm going to tell you we have a problem with nitrate closer to home when it's drinking water. So I want to, if you bear with me, I want to talk a little about how we regulate nitrate in drinking water. We regulate it at 10 milligrams per liter, and we do this because of what is known as blue baby syndrome. That nitrate has the ability to interfere with how oxygen gets transported through the body. And so if you are drinking, if you're an infant or you are a mother who is nursing and you're drinking high levels of nitrate, your baby will have issues moving oxygen through its body and they literally turn blue. That's blue baby syndrome. When we set a regulation, what's known as a maximum contaminant level through the EPA, they first start with a goal. This is the MCLG. And the goal is the blue sky. In a perfect world, if we had no technology limitations, no cost limitations, what would we target our water quality for? That goal at the EPA is 10 milligrams per liter as well. In setting the actual standard that's enforceable, you have to take in cost and benefit and what's actually practically feasible. Right now for nitrate, our best case scenario is the regulation that we have in place. And I would argue that even just looking at that 10 milligram per liter limit, we struggle in Iowa. We talk about in the Des Moines Register, high nitrate levels in 60 cities. If you're getting water off a private well, all those data points in red are above 10 milligrams per liter. And you see this in real time. The University of Iowa has put out a real-time sensor network. So this is looking at the Floyd River just last week, already at 17 milligrams per liter of nitrate, well above our safe drinking water level. And this is water that serves as a drinking water source. That water will need to be treated to be delivered safely. But what we spend a lot of our time thinking about at Cheek is this limit strict enough? Now remember, in the eyes of the EPA, we've met our blue sky goal. We regulated 10, we say the best we should worry about is 10. Not worrying, not taking into account any of the concerns over what it would cost and everything else. But science is evolving. And this is the work out at Cheek has looked at the human health effects beyond blue baby syndrome for nitrate. And it might be tough to read, but we're finding associations with things like colorectal cancer, thyroid disorders, birth defects, and oftentimes at exposure levels that are well below the drinking water limit of 10 milligrams per liter. This is one of those instances, example number 1, where the science now far is outpacing the current regulation. The regulation says we're as safe as we ever want to get, but the data is showing, but wait, that's only if you think about blue baby syndrome. If you open this up to other endpoints, people are living longer. We have to worry about more chronic exposure effects that happen over longer time scales. We might need to do something about this. So what does the data show? That's above 5 milligrams per liter, so about half of the current standard. You do see correlations with bladder cancer, even lower for ovarian cancer, thyroid cancer, reproductive health. This isn't a trivial problem for Iowa. If you look at the Safe Drinking Water Act data that's collected by community water systems, each year there's roughly about 800,000 Iowans that at one point in their life, in that year, are drinking water above 5 milligrams per liter. Oftentimes between the months of March and July, you are routinely drinking above 5 milligrams per liter. Is that something that we should be comfortable with? Because that is the current state of things. The data shows, the science shows there's these health effects we might have to worry about, and there's a big exposure that's coming along with it. So you might have seen this is just the news. The Environmental Working Group, as an advocacy group, published a peer-reviewed paper talking about this problem, that there are these cancer cases that can be associated to nitrate exposure based off nitrate levels in drinking water across the U.S., attributing about 12,500 cancer cases per year to high levels of nitrate. That's not trivial. It's about 300 cancer cases per year that the study was attributing to nitrate in drinking water. This is often colorectal cancer that they're focusing on. So there are tangible, when we think about economic benefits, I mean, one of the other things the study was thinking about, the economic benefits, if you think about the healthcare costs, the sick days, lost work, the inability to sort of function in our normal daily lives, there's real costs associated with not taking action. And so when you think about conservation practices that can help release or reduce nutrient loss, that would improve the quality of our surface water. That would limit this challenge directly. And so you might be thinking, well, what are we doing about it? And I would love to tell you that we have a very nimble, swift government in Washington, D.C., but you know that's not true. And so I always point people towards this, this political piece about essentially the Safe Drinking Water Act. That primary regulation there to protect drinking water, it's effectively broken. It's not working. The last time a new drinking water standard was put on the books was 1996. I was in high school. That's a long time ago. So when I talk about, think about how much our technology has changed since 1996. All of that has been amplified in a research laboratory when it comes to studying where chemicals are and what effects they might cause. The science has evolved so much and the policy is just not keeping up. And it's too much detail to go into why that's the case. But it's something we should all be concerned about is what do we do when the regulations that we assume are there to protect us aren't as protective as we would like them to be? Good. You know, but that's the nitrate story. Manure is not just nutrients. So one of the other things that Iowa is doing really well is, this is a study by the EPA where they were looking at national rivers and streams, and we've probably all heard of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. That there are, through our use of antibiotics, we are basically changing the population of bacteria. We are preferentially growing more and more bacteria that are immune or resistant to those bacteria. One way we can monitor them in the environment is to look for biosignatures of them, and these are often what we refer to as antibiotic-resistant genes. Genes that are associated with the presence of these bacteria in the environment. If you look at the EPA study, they were measuring things like resistance to sulfonamide antibiotics, and they were looking at occurrence of these genes per kilometer river stretch. And sure enough, Iowa is the #1 state in terms of occurrence of antibiotic-resistant genes per kilometer of our rivers and streams. So with all of the antibiotics that we're using in our animal agriculture, we shouldn't be surprised that we are seeing impacts on our ecosystem as a result of that. And that antibiotic resistance will directly lead to compromise our ability to provide health care and lead to more needs in health care, that we have to treat more antibiotic-resistant infections. And then it's pesticides. You know, I often joke when I show these USGS pesticide maps that you can find Iowa because we're always the dark piece right in the middle. And it's true, it's not even exaggeration. Those are things like 2,4-D, glyphosate, atrazine, the neonicotinoids that you've probably heard a lot about with respect to pollinator decline. And so at usages like this, you know, in Iowa this isn't surprising. We can go down to our water treatment plant at the University of Iowa campus, we can take a sample of our finished drinking water, and we can find neonicotinoids in our drinking water. Those are the ones that are applied to corn and soy, used as seed treatment. They're the ones that have been linked to pollinator decline. But there's actually very little known about what the human health implications are, because we registered before we got them registered and on the market before we fully investigated that. And people are beginning to worry about what the health implications might be, that we're finding them in places where we did not expect to see them. When you think of pesticides, most of you probably think of glyphosate. It's been in the news a lot lately. But I want to really bring an important point about glyphosate is first off, the science is evolving. There's great debate as to what the risks are of glyphosate. But make no mistake that the risks that are there for the people that are routinely handling it, so the applicators, the farmers. And so one of the biggest concerns is whether or not there's an association with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma through use and handling of glyphosate and Roundup through agricultural activities. At the levels that you might find, say, in drinking water, there's not that much of a concern to you and I when we get exposed, but if we're actually working with these, so the route of exposure and who's being exposed really matters in the case of glyphosate. So when I talk about pesticides and trying to get people more urgently thinking about what we need to do and change to limit public health effects, I tell the story of Chlorpyrifos. So Chlorpyrifos is more of a specialty pesticide. It's used in orchards. It's not used on many staple crops. It's actually seeing its use on corn and soy go down as things like neonicotinoids and Roundup have grown. And it was first registered as an insecticide in 1965. But by about the year 2000, we were beginning to realize it's also a neurotoxin, and it has impacts on developing brain of children. And so we eliminated uses in households. But we're still using it in parts of the US in terms of agriculture, and so you can see the usage now. It's particularly prevalent in California, where we grow a lot of our nuts, our fruit, year-round. Chlorpyrifos has been in the news because the Obama administration, as part of the registration review, did a new health assessment. And you can go to the EPA website now, and the first part of that health assessment says two things. It says there are no safe residual levels of chlorpyrifos in food. It says there is no safe level of exposure through drinking water. So this is a case that is vastly different from glyphosate. Glyphosate, we're worried about the applicators. This is actually saying that levels you might get through drinking water or incidentally through exposure through air, or what might be left in our food, not safe. This is an issue that affects everybody in this room, potentially. The problem is this is where the science got into odds with the politics. And so the headline on Chlorpyrifos really kind of reached the national scale when the EPA, with the new administration, decided not to revoke the applications for its use. So the plan was to ban Chlorpyrifos based off that health assessment. We are still currently using it today. And so for that reason, you can go to the EPA website, and that first point will say there is no safe level for you to get exposed to in drinking water or food. The next statement down will say, but we're not ready to revoke it. We're still studying the science. Get back to us in 2022. This is a case where the evidence is sound, it's clear, but the politics are not allowing change to happen. So what are we looking at now? I'm not sure showing much of our research, but you can go through and find instances of chemicals we are using more and more where we don't know nearly enough about what the implications are, both for ecosystem and human health. And so fungicides are fascinating to me because use of fungicides is booming, particularly, and they're expected to grow more and more with climate change. More moisture, we expect more fungal challenges, so we're using strobulins, things like pyroclostridium. And that's all well and good until science is beginning to show people are finding links, potentially, to gene expression that you see with respect to neurodegeneration, autism spectrum disorders. Another instance where something has captured the marketplace, but the science is lagging woefully behind to figure out, is it as safe as we want it to be? And so I want to leave you with a few parting thoughts. Certainly how we use our land has consequences for public health. I hopefully haven't scared you too much, but shared some examples of where we know that pretty convincingly. Our scientific understanding of what is safe is going to evolve. Science will improve. Our ability to look at scales that were once unimaginable, we can now do. Think about CRISPR, all these technologies that allow us to understand the human body better. What we know about what is safe is advancing while regulations are essentially stifled. So there are clearly instances where you can point to chemicals where everybody agrees they're unsafe, but we still use them anyways, usually because we don't want to think about the economic consequences of pulling them from the market. To me, I think it's inevitable that we're going to have to lower the nitrate drinking water standard. The evidence is just going to get stronger and stronger and louder and louder. So I think the EPA will have to act, and if they won't act, states should act. It's disappointing that we know some states won't. And then we need to expand our discussion beyond nitrate. So hazards and exposures. What are the health concerns? Where do we get exposed to the other byproducts of agricultural intensification. It's not just nutrients, it's things like antibiotic resistance, it's things like emerging pathogens, which we haven't even discussed, and pesticides. And again, I want to put in a plea, even though I don't have it anywhere here, there has been great work out of USDA and Iowa State showing that things like changing up your crop rotations, putting in buffer strips, you can eliminate the need for heavy pesticide loads. You can capture nutrients. You can slow the release of things like antibiotics into the environment. But we need to get those things more widely implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swartney. And now we're going to hear from Professor Neil Hamilton.
Thank you. See if I can get everything to work here. And we have our slides up. Well, first I want to thank Dwayne for the introduction. Thank Mike Delaney and my other friends of the Iowa Hikes for the opportunity to be with you. And it's a real honor to speak with you and recognize the role that the Hikes have played historically as one of our nation's leading conservation organizations. It's also a pleasure to be with Jerry and David on this panel. I hope you can appreciate their insight and honesty. I'll try to bring my dose. My focus is based on 40 years of teaching agricultural law. I grew up on a farm about 75 miles from here. I went to forestry school not far up the road. And I've taught at Drake University down the road, running our agricultural law center for the last 36 years. But as you'll hear, I'm just in the process of retiring. And one of the projects that I've worked on is a series called Our Water, Our Land. And there's a series of video episodes weekly that we produced last year. And there's going to be a new series of podcasts that are going to begin shortly. And so if you're interested in more of this, you can find it there. But I think one of the things that perhaps the three of us all share is this Ai Weiwei quote, that liberty is our rights to question everything. And unfortunately, one of the challenges that we face, I think, in our systems is that we become perhaps less willing to ask questions. And those of us who are in the public setting, I think it's our obligation to do that. So we're going to begin with a little history. There's a picture of my dad, Lowell, down on our farm in Adams County. That was probably taken, look at him, probably shortly after the war. And there's Zell. There was the well that we got our water from. We didn't have running water in the house till I think I was about 6. And so one of my jobs was to go to that pump and pump buckets of water to bring inside. And we don't farm like our parents. We don't go through changes in life. There's no meal, always glory, and a little later. You know, a couple pictures. There's a person you might recognize. That's me with the long hair, but that's Tom Harkin. His first term in Congress in the summer of 1975. I was a student intern with him, and went back to D.C. for the March for Science a couple springs ago because we need to keep working on these issues. Well, our land, our values remain for the most part. But you know, Ding Darling, and you're going to hear some more from Ding, and you're going to see Tom Milligan on Friday bring Ding to life. But you know, Ding captured those values and the bounty of our land, but he also captured our challenges. And earlier the comment was made that Ding's cartoons could run in the paper today and they'd be timely. And certainly that picture of the farms coming down the Mississippi is a good example. And what I said, my talk is based around 10 main points, and so if anybody's keeping score, this is one of the first ones, is that, you know, we have an incredible legacy of conservation leadership, and the Hikes are certainly part of that, and Iowans, we're proud of it. And people like Leopold and Henry Wallace, Ed Hayden, John Lacey, and of course, Ding Darling, who's pictured here. And Henry Wallace, our Secretary of Agriculture, Vice President, and Wallace in the Yearbook of Agriculture, the 38 yearbook, Soils and Men, maybe some of you have it on your library shelves, wrote this famous quote about the social lesson of soil waste is that no man has the right to destroy soil even if he owns it. If he's simple, Soil requires the duty of man. We've been slow to recognize. Well, 80 years on, we're still a little slow recognizing it. And I guess the question I am left with is, I believe that many of these people would be appalled if they could see us today and what we've done to our land and our water and our streams and what little is left of the habitat and the grasslands that they knew. And so it raises questions. Are we mining our soil so we can grow more corn? This is one of Ding's great images. You know, I mentioned that I'm retiring, and that involved a process of cleaning out an office I've been in for close to 30 years, and going through files and files of teaching materials, and I teach my classes in part out of the newspaper, because living here in Iowa and teaching agricultural law, it's on the front page many days. And I was struck as I went through many of those files. I've been teaching a class called Environmental Regulation of Agriculture for almost 30 years. How little the issues we're dealing with today have changed. The same things we were dealing with 30 years ago: water quality, soil loss, land conversion, pesticide use, and how little improvement we've actually made. And so, you know, just to warn you, this talk may seem a little depressing, but we're going to end on a high note. You know, we've spent a lot of time talking about the same things, and we haven't made a lot of progress. And in fact, if we're honest with ourselves, as you'll see, maybe things, in fact, aren't improving. But so if we come to tolerate soil loss and deteriorating water quality and instead make them partisan political issues, which is one of our challenges. This is one of Dan's great images of Mother Nature spent history putting up this pantry of all these wonderful resources, and civilization has destroyed it, and then at the bottom we spent the rest of our time fighting over who's going to get what little might be left. And so, you know, that's a restored wetland on a farm in north central Iowa. And one of my questions, and again, you're keeping score, this is number 3, we need a little bit more honesty about where we are and our progress. I think that we're short about it in terms of admitting what we may be doing. And we have a combination of, I believe, relatively ineffective policies and also a desire to maximize production on every acre. I mean, Jerry's slides of how we move the corn belt up in the Dakotas with what would be predictable and expected results in terms of the impact on the resources are a good example. We're driving down the road with our foot on the accelerator. Every now and then we tap the brakes, right, when it comes to conservation or water quality. But our commitment is to maximizing production on every acre. And individual landowners are economic maximizers, and that's part of what you didn't have on that slide, but it was really, if you were a landowner in the Dakotas, you'd probably be making the same decision. So there's some of the soil we love. That's along the bike trail along the Raccoon River down at Waterworks Park after one of Iowa's floods. So somebody in Dallas County needed to come back and get their farm. You know, we have a legacy of laws. Iowa's had this law on the books for almost 50 years. In fact, the Supreme Court's upheld the constitutionality of it, that it's the duty of every landowner to meet soil loss limits on their farm. But so has our conservation legacy become an ephemeral gully of inaction? Boy, don't you love that word? I encountered that first in an ASCS office, or I guess now an FSA office, talking about ephemeral gullies, right? And that's it. You see one right there, right? It's that soil loss, but you can go back over it, you till it next year, and you won't see it. And so if you didn't see it, it really didn't happen. And in fact, the USDA doesn't even count, I believe this is right, Jerry, they don't even count the soil losses from ephemeral gully when they're doing soil loss calculations because it doesn't fit into their rules. But, so, Des Moines Waterworks, well, you're here, some of you are going to go out to the chapter, you're going to be right in the middle of Waterworks Park, and we were in the news a few years ago, didn't matter where you were, you probably heard about this lawsuit. And, you know, the Waterworks brought out federal court action against the trustees of drainage districts in several upstream counties and the raccoon. And, it was controversial, as you might imagine. Millions of dollars were spent fighting it and on TV ads demonizing people, including Bill Stowe. Bill was the leader of the Moines Waterworks. Unfortunately, Bill died suddenly this spring of cancer. He was a courageous champion for clean water. And the important thing I think about this case is that it changed the trajectory of the debate about water quality in Iowa and I believe nationally. And so that's part of his legacy. There's a picture, in fact, of the raccoon flowing through Waterworks Park. The lawsuit was dismissed, and I guess some people would say, well, it kind of went away, so it's out of sight, out of mind. But the legal questions that it raised really weren't answered, or at least the Clean Water Act questions weren't. One of the most significant being whether or not tile outlets formed drainage ditches, for example, which were involved in the suit, could actually be considered point sources and subject to some type of regulation. And so those questions weren't answered because of the federal dismissal. The Iowa Supreme Court, though, in the process of reviewing questions that were certified to it, did say that the drainage districts in Iowa have no legal authority or responsibility to do anything to deal with water quality. And so that's the lesson they've taken, and they have since not done anything on water quality and don't believe that they have the authority to. And so there's a question, that's a tile outlet, in fact, on the farm I grew up on. We used to drink out of this tile outlet. In fact, it wasn't quite that big a pipe, it was a small pipe that had a tin cup hanging on it. When I was a kid, if you were down working near the tile line, getting a drink of water was a wonderful place. I'm not sure to do it today, but the question is, was that a tile outlet? And the frustration, I think, that led to the suit grew out of the fact that the waterworks, because they're subject to the Safe Drinking Water Act and had to deal with the contaminant levels for the quality of water they were putting into the system for over 500,000 people, right, a sixth of the state's population, felt that no one else upstream was willing to take any responsibility for what was going into the water. And so, right, after a number of failed attempts to get the legislature to do more, they brought the action. And the point here is I've gone back and looked at this. If you ask yourselves, well, what exactly is Iowa's water quality policy when it comes to agriculture? I guess there's two answers. One, you can say we don't have one, because there isn't, other than dealing with manure applications, there's almost no farm cropping practice you can do that somehow is subject to a regulation. Planting next to the stream, putting in tile outlets, you can put on as much fertilizer as you want to do. There are no limitations on how much you can use. And so a policy, if we have one, is best wishes, I guess. And we do have a nutrient reduction strategy, which is a science-based plan, which is interesting. It's now the state's policy. We incorporated it in the code 2 years ago. But it's devoid of policy. There's nothing in it in terms of how it's actually going to be implemented. Very little funding for it, no priorities. And the one thing it does say is that there's no basis for any type of regulatory approach to help clean water. And so it's essentially an exercise in magical thinking. But, because if you, this is point 7, if you ask yourself the question, why would we expect our rivers and streams to get cleaner, right? Which I think we all hope they're going to. You have to ask yourself, well, what would change exactly? Are we going to grow, right, fewer acres of corn and soybeans? Are we going to have fewer head of livestock? Are we going to change our cropping practices? Are we going to voluntarily put in buffer strips, planted cover crops, retired land next to the streams? And I think the answer is unlikely unless we have more effective public policy. Because again, the reality I think is that most, if not all, of the incentives in our system are designed towards production. That's what the revenue protection plan's about. Prevented plantings, right? $18 billion worth of new welfare that's going to go out the door here in the next few months to deal with the trade situation. Whereas there are very few incentives for conservation. And so here's the thing, do we lack political leadership and will to protect our soil, our water, our land, our wildlife? The problem, or not the problem, maybe this is where we're starting to move uphill again, so this is the happy part, right? We actually have tools that will work. It's not that we don't know how to do this stuff. We know how to deal with soil conservation, right? My God, we've been dealing with this since the late 1930s, right? In terms of practices and how we manage land, how we manage water, which Jerry said is essentially the issue. And so if we wanted to, we could protect our water, improve our soil, and have more sustainable systems. We can harness our HUC 12 watersheds, a little bit more of that in a moment, and empower landowners at the local level to implement water quality, field-based activities like constructed wetlands, like planting cover crops, like putting in buffer strips, like going to minimum tillage, and more effective enforcement of nutrient management plans and guidelines for disposing of animal waste, including not allowing people to dispose it on frozen ground or up to the middle of December, which we allow in our state. So there's one of the water quality monitoring stations. This one's not far away out near Van Meter. David talked about. A wonderful system at the University of Iowa operates, right? These real-time water monitoring systems in over 90 locations in the state now. A wonderful information system, though some people have described them as basically a problem identification system. That's why there was an effort in the legislature a couple of years ago to actually defund the flood center that runs this. Well, I gave a talk at the Iowa Water Conference a couple months ago, and so I'm going to go back and write discourse for a moment. But one of the themes of that talk was the theme of watershed citizenship. And it was taking the idea of watersheds and also citizenship. I mean, you began with the flag and with the Pledge of Allegiance. We're all citizens. We understand what citizenship involves. And part of what citizenship involves is a shared respect for each other and a common commitment to an issue, right? And I think if we apply the values and ideas of citizenship and organize it around the watershed basis, there's some potential power there, right? Because one of the issues that we have to deal with is the moral hazard issue. And the moral hazard issue is, and a good example is, why would you expect people to rebuild a home in a floodplain if they knew it was going to be flooded again? Well, you'd probably rebuild it again yourself if somebody else was going to pay you to rebuild it, right? And it's the whole issue of you taking a risk that somebody else pays the cost for. And so if anything that you put in the water becomes somebody else's problem downstream, whether it's the waterworks or the shrimpers in the Gulf or the Mississippi beachgoers that had their beaches closed over the 4th of July weekend, right? There's the moral hazard, right? The morality of your problems becoming somebody else's to deal with. Because once the water leaves my property, I don't know where it goes, other than I know it goes downstream, right? But a watershed helps us think about we're both downstream and upstream, right? And it's also a way to embody Leopold's land ethic and to think about stewardship. Leopold wrote about our obligations to the land and about how, right, part of our problem was that education makes no mention of obligations over and above those mentioned or dictated by economic self-interest. And we've been too timid and too anxious for quick success to tell the farmer the true magnitude of his obligations. Obligations have no meaning without conscience, and the problem we face is the extension of the social conscience from the people to the land. Of course, he wrote that 70 years plus ago. His conclusion was an ethical obligation on the part of the private owner is the only visible remedy for these situations. And I've added, I think that one of our goals, and the goal that I'm going to try to work for, is taking what may be arguably legal, as many of the practices that we've talked about on this panel today are, and making them morally unacceptable. The fact that you can legally do it doesn't necessarily mean that you should. And so HUC 12 watersheds are a perfect size to address these issues. They're objectively measurable, they're identifiable, they're personal, right? And we have over 1,600 of these watersheds in Iowa alone. So they average about 20-some thousand acres. There's 16 of them typically in a county. And so you know everybody in it, right? Most people could obviously draw the boundary of their school district or their county, but I don't imagine many of you could pull out a piece of paper and draw the boundary of the watershed you live in, right? Because we don't think like that, right? We don't think like a watershed in terms of its boundaries. But yet, we have perhaps more direct impact on the people in our watersheds than we might in our school districts. And so we need to start thinking like a watershed. Here's a good example of a map of some of the demonstration projects we have underway in some watersheds in Iowa. Ooh, that's up in the Great Lakes. And boy, here we're going to end on a high note. I'm optimistic. I believe we can change, our situation can change. There are a number of forces underway that, whether we want to or not, are maybe going to make us change. Climate is certainly one of those. I had the opportunity several times to visit the Arctic and have seen firsthand what has happened, including I was on the island of Svalbard in March of last year, and it had rained for the previous week, rained so much that the ice was on top of the snow and we couldn't even dog sled, right? And this is 800 miles north of the Arctic Circle. So the impacts of climate change, the increasing prevalence of flooding, our attention to soil health, the opportunities for farmers to lead in addressing climate change by managing carbon. And there are states that are taking more, I think, aggressive and assertive actions, Minnesota being a good example, with laws on buffer strips, drainage assessment, and new ones on nitrogen use. So there you can sit at the dock and look towards a better future. And the Ikes can play an important role in this. In fact, you can be proud of the leadership that you have played. Dwayne and Tim and many of you who worked on these issues, you played a key role in the 2018 Farm Bill, making sure that conservation funding was still there. And so looking forward, I think we all have a role to play in supporting both federal programs and more progressive state laws. And I always like to end with a picture of little girls and kitties, because it makes people smile. So with that, I'll turn it over and give you back the rest of our time. Thank you very much.